We continue our program with a panel called Is It Really Decolonization? Discussing Ethics and Agendas of Return. Again, please keep your comments and questions until the end of the panel. And the panel is hosted by Lars Müller of the State Museum of Lower Saxony. Please.
Hello, welcome all to you, especially for the speakers and the commentator. I'm really happy to have you here. Welcome to the panel, Is It Really Decolonization? Discussing Ethics and Agendas of Return. After we talked about early claims for return of objects and about the return of objects in colonial times yesterday, and after talking about claims and returns before the international restitution debate earlier today, we will take another point of view on these questions in this panel. If we look at the current debate about restitution, the demand for the return of objects is closely linked with the objective to decolonization. One motivation to demand restitution is also to decolonize European museums, even if the term is not clearly defined in most of the cases. There's a call for moving towards a more holistic perspective and a relational approach or a rethinking of museums' practices. To rethink discrimination, to overcome colonial thinking, knowledge and hierarchies in museums, to have a diverse approach to the shared history. Returns are seen as a starting point for this kind of new relation between museums and Western societies with the countries and societies of origin. We shortly talked about this in the discussion in the panel before. In this panel, we would like to take a look back. We have papers on the negotiation between Congo or Zaire and Belgium, between Indonesia and the Netherlands, as well as a discourse in several museums in the UK after the Second World War. And we will ask if and to what extent the call for returns and negotiation, as well as returns, led to this kind of new relationship, or on what agendas and ethics the return of the objects were based. I will start with introducing all speakers, and then we will hear the papers. Our first speaker is Sarah von Beurden. She's Associated Professor of History and African American and African Studies at the Ohio State University. I think most of you already know her work and several articles that she wrote about the question of restitution. I would especially point to her book, Authentical African: Arts and Transnational Politics of Congolese Culture. Next to that, I would also like to highlight that she co-authored the recent project Restitution Belgium.be. So it will be in the chat shortly. It's worth to take a look at it. She will talk about the disputes and the past and present of Belgian-Congolese debates about restitution. I think for our discussion, this case is of great importance because we can take a long view of African-European debates on return of objects, from the colonial times over independence up till today. The second speaker is Klaas Stutje, Provenance Research Institute of War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Amsterdam. He's doing research on museum objects from the collection of the Rijksmuseum and the National Museum of World Cultures that were acquired in colonial Indonesia. He will talk about the Indonesian Dutch restitution debates and brings another example to the discussion that spans over several decades. Our third speaker is Claire Wintle. She's Principal Lecturer in Museum Study at the University of Brighton in the UK. Of interest for our discussion is her book, Colonial: Collecting and Display. She will present her current research about curating this decolonization in Britain, 1945 till the 1980s, which is founded by the Powell Mellon Center of British Art. She will talk about repatriation without ethics. While the first two speakers analyze case studies between two countries in the context of international debates, Claire will take a look at the discussion in several museums in the UK and to explore the social and political context of post-war restitutions in different countries of origin. All the papers will have about 15 minutes for the presentation. There will be an acoustic signal after 15 minutes, and I would like to ask you to stop then or to come to a conclusion in the next minute. If you have any questions, please post it in the chat. After the papers, we will have a 10-minute comment from Wim Manuhutu. He's a historian who is specialized in colonial history and the history of Indonesia in particular. He was one of the directors of the Müller Historical Museum in the Netherlands, and since 1909, he has been an independent researcher and curator in the field of heritage, diversity, and inclusion. 2 years ago, he joined the history department at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, where he teaches courses in modern European history. He will comment on all the papers afterwards, and then we would like to open the discussion. So please ask a question in the chat or announce that you would like to ask a question. And without further delay, I'm looking forward to the papers. Please, Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lars. Let me share my screen. PowerPoint, share. Okay, here we go. So let me start by thanking the organizers of the conference for the invitation to participate in this, what I think is a really interesting and a really important discussion. And thank you also for to Lars for the introduction and Wim for the upcoming comments, and my fellow presenters for what I hope will be an interesting discussion. I'm very happy to be here. As you can tell, I have a cold, so I will try to get through this without coughing too much. So what I want to do today is I want to take a brief look at the long history of Belgian-Congolese debates about restitution, and I want to do that with a couple of goals in mind. One is to reflect upon the similarities and differences of the way in which these debates were held in the past and the way in which these debates are taking place today. A second element that I'm very interested in is to reflect on how these histories are narrated and by whom they are narrated, and how causality is assigned in these histories. And I have this interest particularly because the media and beyond, actually, in the contemporary situation, tends to point to President Macron's speech as a moment of origin for these restitution debates, and does not look back further. But I know from my work that I published a while ago already in 2015 that there's actually a long history to these debates, and I think that our understanding of these historical developments changes if we look beyond sort of Macron as a moment of origin and as a cause for these debates. So that's the second element I'm interested in. Third element is to trace sort of the evolution in the understanding of restitution, what restitution entails, and what that says about the way in which decolonization is understood and argued about. So those are the three elements that I would like to explore today through this history of the Congolese case. So before I get to the moment of independence, there's something briefly I want to say about colonial cultural policies that I think helped determine the way in which cultural heritage came to play a role in negotiations about independence. Most among us are familiar with the ideology of the civilizing mission, and African material culture and objects often played an illustrating role in that ideology as evidence of the so-called quote-unquote primitivism of African communities and cultures, thereby justifying colonialism. Those kinds of narratives, I argue, shift towards the 1950s, towards an ideology or a narrative that I call cultural guardianship. This parallels a number of developments. This parallels a shift in Belgian colonialism towards what was called welfare colonialism, with more attention to providing structures and infrastructures of quote unquote the welfare state in the colony. At least that was the discourse. Things that are described sort of in the context of the French Empire as by Gary Wilder, for example, but also this evolution of certain objects in this realm of African objects, or what today we would call African art objects, or historical objects, move into the realm of art. That means that their role in this ideology of the civilizing mission becomes uneasy. So what I argue that is in sort of the rhetoric of cultural guardianship by the 1950s, it is actually the protection and preservation of quote unquote traditional arts that had become a justification for the Belgian colonial regime. The justification being that the Belgian colonial regime needs to be there to protect and preserve these objects because Congolese communities themselves are unable to value their historical legacies, the valuable elements in their historical legacies. Why they arrive at this sort of particular construction is something that we can talk about in a discussion if you want. But what that means, concretely speaking, is that these pieces, these objects, gain a political role, start playing a political role. And of course, Congolese become aware of this role as well. And there are attempts in the 1950s of Congolese leaders, for example, to try and reappropriate the potential of these objects as a political tool by trying to, for example, establish local museums under local control. Another element in which we see, oops, I skipped one, yes. This have an effect is in the way in which independence is conceived of, and the role in which the restitution or the return of these collections becomes an element in these negotiations over around independence in 1960 between Belgium and Congo. And in this context, these collections are part of what is referred to as les contentieux at the time, sort of the disputed assets. What most famously is referred to as le contentieux is actually the mining companies, the companies in the Katanga region, the possession of the mineral riches of Congo, the negotiation over the transfer of that to the independent state. But what was also being discussed in the same context, and it is often forgotten, is these collections of Congolese heritage. Most of the collections actually that are today still in the museum near Brussels, in the museum, the African Museum in Tervuren. So these demands become part of the sort of the discourse around independence negotiations. So what gives these objects and their collections their value at that point is, of course, one, the sort of financial and economic value that they have gained through the emergence of a market for these objects, which makes it akin to these mineral resources of a soon-to-be independent country. Two is their symbolic value as a representation of pre-colonial Africa and pre-colonial African cultures. And this is something that will grow along the years as we will see that element. A third fact is, of course, very importantly, that their possession had become symbolic of Belgium's cultural guardianship over Congo, and a restitution would therefore confirm Congo's cultural sovereignty. So the possession of these collections become a central element in the way in which cultural sovereignty is conceived of at this moment. In the 1960s, these negotiations sort of disappear into the background because of the political and because of the unrest in Congo mostly. But they re-emerge towards the end of the 1960s, when a man named Mobutu, later he renames himself Mobutu Sese Seko, a much longer name actually, Joseph Désiré Mobutu, as he was known at the time, comes to power in Congo through a military coup. It was actually a second military coup in 1966. And it is in the context of his early reign that these demands for restitution resurface. The immediate reason for the resurfacing of these demands actually has to do with a traveling exhibition organized by the Belgian Museum in North America that drew quite a lot of media attention, and that drew media attention in Congo at the time. So it gives rise to this demand specifically actually for the 200 objects of this traveling exhibition in the United States. This introduces an era of a lot of back and forth between particularly the presidential office, so the people surrounding Mobutu, and the Belgian government and the Belgian Museum in particular. It gives rise to a wider context of collaboration in which also the Institut des Musées Nationaux is founded in Congo as a museum infrastructure in collaboration with Belgium. So that takes place sort of in the context of these negotiations around restitution. But what gives the demand for restitution its sort of specific power and meaning in this period is, on the one hand, its association with Mobutu's authenticité politics. This was a cultural ideology, became the official cultural ideology of the Congolese state, which in the same context was renamed Zaire. And it was aimed ostensibly at a cultural decolonization, at the shedding of the cultural damage that had been inflicted upon these cultures, upon Congolese cultures through colonization. There's, of course, a lot more to be said about that and the intersection of this particular cultural ideology and the rising authoritarianism of the Mobutu regime. The second element in the context in which this demand is important is actually the context of the international profile of the Mobutu regime, because it is an element in the way in which Mobutu seeks to profile himself as an international leader, an African international leader. During an important speech that he gives to the United Nations in 1973, he actually raises the issue of what he at the time then calls the systematic pillage of the heritage of African countries. So what are some of the counter arguments that we see at this point arise on the Belgian side against this demand for restitution? And I want to talk about these a little bit because it's interesting how some of them resurface later on. One, there's the argument of the universal scientific value of these collections as a whole. We can talk about sort of the way in which the constructions behind these arguments, if you're interested in the discussion. Two, there's the argument that these are all legally acquired. Because the museum has received them for the most part from, for example, former colonials. So that transaction is legal, is argued. The argument of the lack of infrastructure, museum and legal in Congo in order to protect and conserve and preserve these artifacts. This is the context in which actually the museum infrastructure in Congo is then founded. And a fourth element that we see emerge is the contesting of this interest in the collections of the Tervuren Museum, specifically, sort of this demand of, well, why aren't you looking at collections that are, for example, in the United States? Why this focus on the collections in Belgium in particular? And it emerges that the big stumbling block in these debates is the concept of restitution, actually. At the Belgian side of these negotiations sort of refuses to, and this is a very short version of a long history, refuses to accept the term restitution because of what it implies, because it implies a certain view on a past historical injustice that was involved in the removal of these objects. It carries that within it. So what the Belgian state at this point says is that they are willing to consider a gift of objects to Zaire. They're not willing, as long as Zaire will distance itself from the use of the term restitution because of its implications about, the judgment it entails on Belgian colonialism. Once the Zairean state actually makes this concession, it does this through a museum employee that participates in a UNESCO panel, and that's where she then announces that they agree with the Belgian view on this potential transfer of objects as a gift. That actually does trigger a transfer of 114 objects from the storerooms of the Tervuren Museum to the museum infrastructure that has been created in Kinshasa. Only one of these objects, the object that you see in the picture here, was actually part of those original 200 that had been asked of the traveling exhibition. So on the one hand, this is excuse me, a fairly unique event. This is a transfer of 114 objects from Belgium to Zaire. On the other hand, one context that matters here is also the complete sort of the number of objects that Tervuren possesses at this point, which is around 125,000 objects. So, but 114 do go back. So the debates today cast this discussion on the one hand in a context of restitution, That word has regained a lot of its sort of relevance and power, but it has been sort of extended to debates about reparation. So it's extending this discussion, I would argue, sort of in a broader sense, towards debates about reparation that go towards the long-term impact and effect of the removal of these objects. And the second context in which we see a lot of these debates is this context of decolonization of museum institutions in the global north, but actually also in the global south. What are some of the differences? The role of the African diaspora is so incredibly important in bringing this debate back to the fore, particularly on sort of in the global north itself. The second element that I think that is significantly different is a generational shift that we see in Belgium and perhaps also in Congo, which is an interesting question with regard to the colonial past and the way in which younger generations position themselves and see this colonial past. A third element that plays an important role today is this emergence of new African infrastructures, among which a brand new museum infrastructure built in Kinshasa through South Korean development aid money. Generally speaking, we see a context of a lot more political and cultural responsiveness today. So I want to wrap up here and look at what are some of the lessons, or I think important elements to keep in mind, looking from this longer history of negotiations to the debate today. One is the importance of language. And as I told you, the importance of the use of the term restitution and perhaps also the use of the term reparations, as opposed to the description of some of these interactions as gift or support or cooperation, for example. Another particular sort of discourse in which that is important to keep at the back of your mind is this discourse around sort of shared or universal heritage. The discourse around universal heritage is older, right? It goes back to the 1970s, 1960s. Today, we see this version of this discourse around shared heritage. Which implies that these objects are sort of the result of a history of two places. But that is exactly the kind of heritage that does, sort of the kind of language that does work that we need to be careful about, I think, because we need to be mindful of the history of inequalities that is embedded in this seemingly universal language, as we see it with this tension between gift and restitution as well. So this history of naming of the language we use, from contentieux to restitution, to gift, to restitution, to reparation, is quite significant in the context of restitution debates, but also in the context of how thinking about decolonization evolves, in my opinion. That's 15. Okay, well, that's good. I'm almost done. Arguments against restitution are remarkably similar today to what they were in the 1960s and 1970s. For example, arguments around care for collections and care for objects reflect some of the same elements that these objects around, that these arguments around conservation reflected in earlier decades. I'm going to skip the second question on this slide. I'm going to go to the issue of UNESCO, because that's something I haven't addressed yet. And I think that is actually a continuum from the 1960s, 70s until now, and it's a very important element. What we see in the 1970s, and this is something that Mabutu is responding against with his UN speech, is this sort of failure of UNESCO rules and regulation to take into account the transfer of heritage during the colonial era. This is something that in many ways continues today. And I think that global organizations like UNESCO continue to sort of fail to provide a sufficiently powerful framework in order to deal with these issues, which helps sustain certain historic inequalities, I would argue. And last, I want to close by remarking upon this historic causality and the way in which we construct and tell these particular stories of the history around restitution, because it is the long history of demands from African places, and Congo isn't the only place that has this long history that plays a significant role in this, and it is also the role of African diaspora activists in keeping this issue on the agenda in Europe that helps give rise to Macron's speech. And these are elements that become invisible if we take too limited a view on sort of the more recent developments. So that is I will end here, and we can talk a little bit more if there's an interest about concrete contemporary initiatives that are taking place in Belgium or in Congo around the issue of restitution, if there's an interest in that in the discussion. Thank you so much, and I will hand over the word again.
Thanks a lot for your paper, and all the best for your voice. Please, Klaas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll also share screen now. Share. So I think you can all see my screen right now. And can you all hear me also as well? I think so.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction that you just gave, Lars. And I'm actually very happy to be part of this wonderful and very timely conference as well. And I want to thank Lars and Jan and Larissa and also Steffi and other people that I've been corresponding with for organizing this conference and this panel. As Lars, I believe, already mentioned, I am involved in a pilot project in the Netherlands with the name PROS. PROS stands for Pilot Project Provenance Research on Objects of the Colonial Era. And this is a project that started in November 2019 and will actually end in March 2022. So we have a couple of more months to go. And it aims to gain experience in doing provenance history, provenance research to objects and collections currently in the Netherlands, and also to come to methodological recommendations about how such future research to objects acquired within a colonial context can be done. And we focus as yet on Indonesia and also Sri Lanka. However, today I will talk about not a side project of PROS, but an important aspect, I think, of this of the work that we are doing, namely an assessment of the longer history of the Indonesian Dutch heritage debates, a long history that is important to situate the present day debates around restitution, as Sarah just mentioned as well. Now, for this panel, I was asked to reflect on the question, is it really decolonization? Did the restitution of Indonesian cultural heritage in the Netherlands in the 76 years since the proclamation of independence, did this really fit the agenda of decolonization? And of course, this is a very difficult question to answer, not only because the agenda of decolonization can be interpreted in many, many ways, with the terms such as decolonization being very complex, very multifaceted, as complex also as terms such as colonialism itself and post-colonialism. And it is also difficult to answer this question because it's maybe perhaps not up to me as a European researcher working in 2021 to determine what benefited and what did not benefit the agenda of decolonization. Yet, I can make observations, and today I want to build two arguments. One argument that refutes this notion of decolonization as too simple a frame of understanding restitution events. And the second argument that argues that knowledge production around restitution and also provenance research is also a way of overcoming one of the legacies of colonialism, namely a disadvantaged knowledge position for formerly colonized countries. And in that sense, it certainly is decolonization. So with regards to the first argument, overlooking 76 years of restitution debate between the Netherlands and Indonesia, and after also reading fantastic publications by Jos van Beurden, Cynthia Scott, and most recently also Panga Ardiansyah, who we just heard speaking in the previous panel, and Wiske Sapardan. In that way, I wish to stress that I'm certainly not the first or the only one in this field of research. I want to argue that decolonization as an agenda and also the reparation of past injustices was in none of the moments of intense debates about restitution. And in none of the moments of actual return, the only driving force, or even the most important factor. There were always always other motives more prominent that had to do with the contemporary interests of Indonesia or of the Netherlands in a particular era and context. So just to give you a few examples, in the spring of 1951, Mohammed Yamin, who was a writer and a poet, and also a bit later a Minister of Education and Culture, publicly claimed a few objects back, namely a few paleoanthropological remains, it's the Dubois collection, an important manuscript, Negara Kartagama, and also an old Buddhist statue with the name of Prajnaparamita, representing Prajnaparamita. And like these claims, they fitted in the plans to reinforce nationalist attitudes in the young Indonesian Republic and to gain truly national symbols that could speak to the entire nation. Another example, so the high-profile returns of important objects that took place between 1970 and 1978, starting again with Negara Kartagama and ending again with Prajnaparamita. These returns, they occurred in a frame of 2 decades when the Netherlands and the rest of the Western world fostered good relations with the Suharto regime. And for those of you who maybe do not know so well, this regime had come to power after a coup and a counter coup in 1965 and committed a large-scale politicide against communists and the Indonesian left at large. So this new rapprochement between the West on the one hand and the Suharto regime on the other hand clearly fitted in the Cold War agenda that was very relevant at that time. I think about the Vietnam War and other things going on in Southeast Asia. And the third example that I want to give today, maybe a bit provocatively also, is that today decolonization and redressing historical injustice is not the only motive behind engaging with restitution debates. Because for Western ethnographic museums or former ethnographic museums and museum professionals, the renewed awareness of the colonial origins of their collections is an intrinsic part of their struggle to redefine the relevance of their museums in the 21st century. So in other words, the restitution debate often said more about the power relations and the interests of the two countries in the contemporary, so in the then now, than about some sort of a long-lasting or interrupted agenda and interrupted urge to decolonize. So that said, I'm indeed inclined to take a skeptical stance with regards to the question, was it really all about decolonization? Still, and this is then the second argument that I would want to build, even when we observe that contemporary interests often overshadow the agenda of decolonization, we can contemplate on long-lasting effects of unequal colonial power relations, effects on this long history of the restitution debate. And one of the many difficulties that Indonesia had to overcome, for instance, was a neglected colonial education system or a barely existent education system, and a general lack of expertise and know-how. And this also applied to the cultural sector. And it had as a consequence that the Indonesian side of bilateral cultural negotiations, they always acted from a disadvantaged knowledge position. Dutch politicians already possessed lists of Indonesian heritage in the Netherlands in 1949. And they were assisted by heritage experts and museum professionals such as Pieter Pot in Museum Volkenkunde, Hans Steeuw in KITLV throughout the decades. But the Indonesian delegations had to invest a lot of energy to find out what was actually present in these many Dutch collections. And this is not to say that there were no knowledgeable Indonesians at that time, but their knowledge did not seem to reach the negotiation table at that moment. So So this led to two interconnected negotiation strategies on the Indonesian side. So on the one hand, they repeatedly requested their Dutch colleagues and counterparts to provide overviews of Indonesian objects and collections in Dutch museums and depots. Or if they could not have it, and they did not really get that, they undertook initiatives to compile such lists themselves. See, for instance, a formal request for such a list of the Secretary General of the Indonesian Ministry of Culture in 1956, and again, semi-official missions to compile such lists in 1963, again in 1970, in 1974. So this was one strategy to try to get this overview. And on the other hand, the Indonesian delegations often focused on the most important few objects present in the Netherlands, not only because they were the most important objects, but also because they served in the negotiations, in the debates, as a pars pro toto for the Indonesian collections in the Netherlands at large. And these objects included, and I heard Mas Pangga Ardiansyah just here talking about Pusaka of Indonesia. These are then the Pusaka of Indonesia, and I can argue that maybe 80 to 90% of all the negotiation dealt with these objects. Also with archives, by the way, I will not be talking about that. But for instance, you have the Negara Kartagama manuscript that I just mentioned before, which stands for actually a large collection of manuscripts, mainly in the Leiden University Library, and also stands for well, some sort of cultural unity of the whole archipelago, Nusantara. It was returned in 1970. Then you have Prashna Paramita, returned in 1978, which actually stands for a larger number of Singasari statues, or you could argue for the entire Hindu-Buddhist collection in the Netherlands, and again also for Nusantara cultural unity. The Dubois collection, which stands for paleoanthropological objects in the Netherlands, which has never returned. Then we have paintings of Raden Saleh. It's a bit of a different story, but these paintings that, for instance, talk about the arrest of Diponegoro, they stand for objects of historical value in general. The objects of Prince Diponegoro in general, again, about objects of historical value. And then you have Bali and Lombok treasures, which stand for regalia of other regalia of former kingdoms and sultanates. Now, a few of these objects disappeared off the list because they were returned in the 1970s, leaving behind the many similar objects of their categories. And as the list of prominent objects became shorter in the 1970s, it also became more difficult to keep the topic of restitution on the political agenda, despite, by the way, promises of the Dutch to continue this agenda. So the period between the 1980s and the 2010s saw a few more returns, but they were no longer part of the execution of official government policy on either the side of the Dutch or on the side of the Indonesians. Yet, this is changing, and I would like to end with maybe a hopeful note also, because you are perhaps aware that new steps are being taken in the Netherlands to come to a more structured and sound restitution policy. One aspect of this is that the minister has urged all Dutch museums and heritage institutions to at least know their colonial collections and to undertake renewed efforts to examine their content and also their past. But perhaps lesser known to you is that Indonesia is also very busy in establishing an infrastructure for what they call the repatriation of Indonesian heritage in the Netherlands. And all this happens in a sphere of collaboration between both countries and well, good mutual relations. But it is interesting to observe that Indonesia also tries to keep the initiative in their own hands, on their own terms, and that they try to build an independent knowledge position. We saw that this already with the return of the Nusantara collection. I will not talk about that today, but I will discuss that today. There's a special repatriation committee, Comité Repatriation, that was established in January 2021, so January of this year, which contains also an academic working group of historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, that has to professionalize the study of Indonesian heritage abroad. And moreover, MA and PhD scholarship programs of the Indonesian Ministry of Education, Culture and Science explicitly encourages candidates to study the repatriasi benda warisan budaya, so the repatriation of cultural heritage objects in the Netherlands. It is to be hoped that these new initiatives lead to new and also alternative interests in Indonesian heritage in the Netherlands, based on a in-depth knowledge of what is present in the Netherlands, and also beyond the most important few objects that we often see. And I would like to end here. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for your paper, and I would like to hand over to Claire. Claire? Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm just trying to sort myself out a little bit. There we go. Great.
Perfect.
Can you hear me okay and see my screen and everything?
Everything is perfect. Thanks.
Super.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much to the conference organisers, and especially to Wim for responding to us in turn. It's really a pleasure to be part of this today. So between 1945 and 1970, museums across the UK discussed and sometimes facilitated the return of cultural heritage to countries of origin. Yet this little known pre-1970s British practice is distinct from more recent international debates around restitution. This discourse on return was instead born of apathy, both towards collections from beyond Britain and their rightful owners. These transfers contravened several contemporary ethical benchmarks. Mostly before 1970, return presented an abdication of responsibility to the heritage and peoples of Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. Drawing on archival research in UK museums, this paper explores the social and political context for this post-war discourse around what we might, with a certain amount of ambivalence, call return. It focuses on language, professional networks, and material conditions, and urges us to acknowledge that return does not equate to decolonization. I first explore the main characteristics of these post-war transfers before examining how they were related to the ethics of the time and how we can understand them in relation to the ethics of today. The long history of resistance against colonialism through the return of cultural heritage must be qualified by the colonialism and neo-colonialism that we see in these early cases. I argue that understanding problematic historic practices of so-called return can help advocate for an ethical practice of the future that centres claimant needs. So World War II ravaged British museum buildings and collections. After the war, there was no money or staff to support regeneration. Piles of objects returned from wartime storage hurriedly placed in cramped storerooms without their documentation. Single or small numbers of curators were often responsible for very wide-ranging collections. They were commonly archaeologists or historians, and some were deeply uninterested or had other pressing concerns. So for many curators, a sense of apathy and what we might call object anxiety began to take hold. Goguen and Hess have used the term object love to describe the effective embodied space of the museum storeroom. They describe object love in the museum as linked to Bell Hooks's conception of love as a combination of care, commitment, trust, knowledge, responsibility, and respect. But the post-war archives of British curators are instead, or also, infused with an emotional response that frames the volume and sheer materiality of their collections as dangerous. Staff at the British Museum, for example, described the backlog of collections documentation and poor storage conditions as causing, quote, confusion, embarrassment, great difficulties, and anxiety. This was a period of emotional investment in museum collections, but the overriding emotion was not love. We see a similar anxiety echoed in popular concerns over imperial decline and post-war immigration in UK at the time. India achieved independence in 1947, and the collapse of empire in parts of Africa and the Caribbean in the 50s and 60s challenged Britain's national status. Concurrently, immigration from the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent grew throughout the 1950s, generating great hostility in Britain. As empire and immigration became increasingly controversial, most provincial museums and some nationals instead promoted a policy of so-called regionalisation, which favoured local or British objects, and they isolated their localities from the wider world. Changing tastes and budgets and a focus on displayability all led to a post-war interest in deaccessioning collections through exchange, sale and destruction. And altogether, this created a particular post-war situation where certain forms of international repatriation could flourish. By 1965, several museums had transferred cultural heritage to countries and institutions in the global south. Some examples are now fairly well known, others are not. So I've got a list. I'm working really hard to populate it, but it's taking quite a long time, and it's obviously, new things are popping up all the time. So if you know of any more, let me know. So in 1948, Roger Duff from the Canterbury Museum in New Zealand toured the UK, negotiating the transfer to his museum of Maori and other Polynesian material from museums in Glasgow, Bristol, Halifax, Preston, Peebles and Wisbech. Museums in Leicester, Leeds, Sheffield and the Cumming Museum in London all transferred collections to dealer Kenneth A. Webster, with the understanding that parts of them at least would go to Aotearoa, New Zealand. In 1950 and 1951, the British Museum sold 26 Benin plaques to Nigeria, to the National Museum. We also have museums in Newbury, Littlehampton and Poole, and the Royal Scottish Museum all sending objects to Nigeria too. And the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum sent materials to museums in Nigeria, Ghana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Uganda and New Zealand. And we know that the V&A and the British Museum repatriated their Buddhist relics to India and Sri Lanka. And the University of Cambridge repatriated the regalia of the Ganda war deity Kabuka to Uganda. And then finally, in this inevitably incomplete list, the V&A also returned to Burma a series of royal treasures that have been seized at Mandalay. So importantly, in these cases, museum professionals involved never employed the terms repatriation or restitution, and return was only occasionally used. They were called transfers or exchanges and rarely linked to the unlawful historic acquisition of property. In some cases, this was political, but mainly this is because problematic collecting histories were barely considered. Instead, particularly in provincial museums, those who supported the return of cultural heritages to countries of origin did so because they saw it as an easing of the pressures that non-European collections placed on museum curators in the UK. For example, Leeds Museum's director gifted his ethnographic collection to Kenneth Webster, the British-based dealer from New Zealand, and initially justified this as an act of return. He suggested that he was, quote, strongly in favour of handing it over, as I know that some most important pieces will go straight out to New Zealand. But he also quickly acknowledged how his actions were generated by the apathy and anxiety that I've already described, using the language of exhibition and conservation to justify his decision. In our case, he said, we haven't room to display it, we haven't a hope of displaying it, and some quite valuable stuff is deteriorating badly. In the early 1960s, the curator of archaeology at Bristol Museum argued that the museum's ethnographic collection should be, quote, drastically pruned and disposed of by sale, gift or otherwise. He specifically hinted at the possibility of return, highlighting how many countries were now setting up their own museums. The curator's arguments for disposal and potential repatriation were supported by a series of safe and respectable museum reference. He noted the collections themselves are patchy, they no longer have their former popular appeal, and there would be insuperable difficulties in increasing them. So in addition to this focus on the comprehensive scope of the collection, on displayability and acquisition potential, the availability and requirements of Western scholarly knowledge were also key reference in his and others' rationales. As an archaeology curator, he couldn't be expected to care for non-European collections because, quote, the two subjects are very different and require different mental disciplines. In these cases, return acted as a way of supporting the rationalisation of unloved collections, freeing British curators to attend more fully to prioritised European objects that remained. In some cases, return also provided a solution to financial mismanagement. So Wisbech Museums Committee accepted the New Zealand government's offer of £150 for its Polynesian material in the context of a dire economic situation, and they were selling off assets at the time pretty much willy-nilly. Because return was so closely affiliated to the Eurocentric, Enlightenment-orientated practical priorities of the museum, communities of origin and their mental disciplines were rarely prioritised in any of these dealings. The Bristol curator insisted that African states should quite naturally look after their own culture. But in the context of his own research on prehistoric England and enthusiastic advocacy for collections regionalisation, possible return provided a convenient opportunity to focus on the material culture of white people. It also denied the diaspora populations that were living around him. Similar comments at Leeds exposed the hypocrisy and racialized nature of such statements when Pacific objects were exchanged with Webster for French and Belgian objects, also apparently of little local relevance to Leeds. So the idea of return also becomes problematic when we learn that many of the transfers did not relate to just one community or even country. So Webster claimed to be advocating for New Zealand, but Leicester, Leeds, Sheffield and Cumming Museum all gave him material from other countries too. Those that were not Taonga Maori mostly ended up in the collections of other dealers, other European or American museums, or on the open market. And return was also often predicated on the ability of white men to access the museum's space by means of their ethnicity, their professional status, and their expertise. For example, correspondence at Leeds Museum shows how Webster's reputation was built up through a process of recommendation and prior success with other museums. And the fate of objects once returned also depended on professional networks too. So Canterbury Museum's Roger Duff had an even higher status in British museums. Identifying objects, he shares his professional expertise in return for the objects that he takes back with him to New Zealand. And British curators engaged with him as a white museum professional that was endorsed by the New Zealand government and the British Council. So post-war return constitutes a self-interested, Eurocentric, museum-focused practice that aligns closely with the intellectual and practical status quo. Repatriation was for some a convenient strategy for prioritizing white European collections and discounted the potential of migrant and mixed heritage audiences for British museums. Repatriation was also conducted along racialized and exclusionary structures of professional and imperial affiliation. So how then can we understand the ethics surrounding these practices? So as Besterman suggests, ethical frameworks always respond to the shifting values of the society to which they serve. And they're also, it's commonly understood, supposed to align with the stated values and purpose of an institution. So if we acknowledge that the mission of mid-20th century museums was aligned with Enlightenment-informed collections care, then we could argue, in some respects at least, that return, with its justification in conservation, display, documentation, and scholarship around European collections, might be seen as an ethical practice of the mid-20th century. Return seems to align with the mission of the museum at the time. Yet in more recent conceptualizations of the new museum ethics, ethical practice is also understood as a moral agency, doing good with museum resources, and as a driver for change. Notwithstanding the apparent racism of post-war return, in this more radical framework, repatriation between 1945 and 1970 is not ethical. The UK's first code of ethics was published by the Museums Association in 1977. And here disposal was a central point of discussion, inspired by the 1964 Cottesloe report into the sale of works of art by public bodies. And that codified a strong presumption against disposal. It highlighted the purposes intended by the donor rather than the maker and the rights of the public. Yet even before these formal shifts, gifting objects to dealers and to those beyond the UK held an uneasy place in professional practice. Most exchanges were nominally or entirely unrecorded in museum documentation. Object disposal numbers were often minimized under so-called war damage. Some curators even regretted sending material back, concerned about compromising British collections. Despite having sold his museum's collection to Webster in 1950, only 2 years later, Leicester's director confessed that, "I am not completely happy at the way in which all ethnology is disappearing from the country. If I had the chance again, I should stick hard to a good collection." In 1952, at the V&A, agreeing to transfer Buddhist relics, the director remained reluctant, cautioning how, once the trickle has started, it may well become a flood. So here, return was partial, unenthusiastic, and lacked confidence. So the conflicting demands at the heart of post-war British museum practice are clear. The donor, a generic public, and Eurocentric modes of collections care are the triumvirate prioritized in the museum's mission, but the incompatibility of donor expectations and a rationalized collection that would appeal to the public generated ethical loopholes which museum staff could exploit to support their own requirements at any particular moment. And expressions of uncertainty demonstrate the contradictions inherent in processes of return and British museum practice at the time. Overall, return was often a convenient, confused strategy for a racist Eurocentric rationalization of British museums. Concern for the returned collections and the people to which they belonged was minimal. Transfers may sometimes have narrowed distance between communities of origin and their cultural heritage, but the hurried, informal structures of return meant that objects were often separated from their documentation and provenance. Communities of origin rarely benefited from return, but some treasures were instead returned to neo-colonial government-run institutions. And in some cases, objects ended up further away from their communities, on the open market or in museums in other countries. So early examples of repatriation can be sites for inspiration and collective resistance against museums unwilling to engage in social justice today. But these examples show that return is not necessarily socially just or inherently decolonial. Here, objects were transferred without a concern for their rightful owners, and return was motivated by the self-interest or ambivalence of the museums or states involved. They indicate lessons in the damage of performative restitution, separated from a socially just practice of engagement with community needs. Post-war activities in the UK remind us that return is not a politically or professionally neutral activity, but one informed by the material conditions and political and policy discourses of the moment, just like it is today. In our contemporary times, then, we need to see all acts of return as situated practice and interrogate the conditions that frame them. Thanks very much.
Thanks to you, Claire. That was really great to hear all of you. And I would like to hand over to Wim for his comments. Afterwards, we have a small round with all the presentators to reflect on the comments, and then we will open the discussion. So if you have any questions, please write in the chat or lift your hand. So Wim, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lars. And first and foremost, I want to thank the organizing committee for having me. And of course, Sarah, Claire, and Klaas for wonderful, rich, and also thought-provoking presentations. And one thing that I found listening to you and also having the privilege of reading your papers beforehand was that the importance of looking at these deep histories, moving beyond a rather shallow understanding of what the discussion and the debate and the policies surrounding repatriation, restitution, or other terms that might be used, the importance of looking further into the history. And something that I found striking also, yet again, in all your presentations, the similarities, even though all of your presentations are very deeply rooted in deep research, in very contextualized and localized and situated situations and knowledge, that the political is always very much present, and contemporary interest are steering these discussions. When I listened to and looked at Sarah's presentation, this struggle for cultural sovereignty immediately also was echoed in Klaas's presentation when he quoted Muhammad Yamin, where cultural nationalism, so cultural decolonization, if you may, and if we want to use that word, was also on the forefront in the mind of rulers of former colonies. One other very striking similarity, and this goes especially for the case of the Netherlands and Indonesia, is that even though in 1949 at the Roundtable Conference there was a cultural paragraph, there was a cultural commission, and people talked about cultural collections, the first time that actual repatriation took place was in a time, and here is the similarity with the Belgian case, when one might say a dictator was in charge in Congo, Mobutu, and in Indonesia, Suharto, and especially when it comes to the Netherlands, I think the overthrow of the Sukarno regime, who was considered by many in the Netherlands as the ultimate nemesis of Dutch colonialism, I think did play a role where it was easier, and Klaas very aptly pointed to the fact that after Suharto came into power, Indonesia became a very popular ally or development ally of the West. Then at the time, return would be more acceptable in the sense that it wouldn't be a return to the former embodiment of the Indonesian revolution. What I think is very, very important, and it comes back in all three presentations, is the role of discourse, and also the importance of historical research of that discourse and a critical analysis, where, for instance, in the case of Congo, giving objects or returning objects to Congo is a gift rather than restitution, because the word comes with a whole different meaning and a whole contingent of responsibilities. And of course, if we look at Claire's presentation, when I read her paper and when I listened again to Claire's presentation, it was very sobering to see that that returning objects can very well take place in a situation where colonialism and neo-colonialism is still rife, where negative objectives and arguments are basically behind these actions, and where ethics, as you very, very pointedly show, play no role at all. And so when I look at the presentations, I also feel the urge, and I feel that it is very important to have this conversation on an international and transnational level, and to basically move beyond what has been coined as methodological nationalism, where people do tend to look at their own country, at their own particular histories, which is understandable, but without taking into account that similar processes take place in other countries. Perhaps the time frame is different, because Claire talks about immediate post-war developments that stretch until the early 70s and perhaps even beyond, whereas some of the processes that took place in Congo and Belgium, but also in the Netherlands, started somewhat later. But what we do see, and perhaps you would all three like to comment, is also the continuity of some of these arguments that were formulated in these earlier times, basically to justify the preserving of colonial collections, the hesitance of returning colonial collections. And Sarah, if I'm not mistaken, you used this wonderful term, cultural guardianship. And of course, we see that returning even to this very day under other nomens, but basically proposing the same arguments. We can take better care of those objects than people and institutions and states in these former colonies. What I was thinking, and this is particularly a question to Claire, that in your presentation, one might say, where is the Commonwealth? Did the Commonwealth in any sense play a role in these conversations, or were these conversations, and this is the feeling I get after reading and listening to your presentation, were very private, were very low-key, one might say. There was very scant documentation, if there was documentation at all, because one might say that the Commonwealth, and in the Dutch case, it was the short-lived Dutch-Indonesian Union that was basically, stopped by Sukarno at the time. How did that play into to the discussion on collections and possible repatriation? So these are some of my first thoughts that came up after reading and also again listening to your wonderful presentations. And I'm looking forward to your responses and also to the pressing and important questions that undoubtedly will come up from this very also expert audience that we have with us today. So back to you, Lars.
Make sure that they return it to an official entity, which is the state, knowing that of course there are these difficulties with regions that might also claim their heritage back, but then they say, well, we don't want to interfere in internal matters. Which, I mean, on the one hand, I can see that, and then, yeah, I maybe agree. On the other hand, it's also an easy way not to get into very complicated histories that are actually our own history. I mean, speaking from the Dutch context, the Dutch were also responsible in creating these antagonisms within the Indonesian state. So it's also quite easy and to say, well, we will not talk about it. We will just return to the Indonesian state. So, so this was one thing, and one thing that I really liked about Claire's presentation also is that myself and also other authors that have been talking about the Indonesian context, we focus very much on diplomatic sources and on state sources, and then we miss actually what is going on a more local level in the Netherlands, for instance, with the local museums. And also in Indonesia with families or regional or local museums that might also claim, but that we just miss because we don't look into those sources. I think in the Dutch-Indonesian case, that's more poignant in the 1980s and 1990s, more so than in the 1950s and 60s. But still, this is, I think this, yeah, I think there's work to be done on the Dutch-Indonesian side as well in this regard.
Yeah, I think that's right. And actually, I didn't have a chance to explore in 15 minutes the different types of, almost the different strata of museums in the UK and the different responses they have to that. I think your questions about what role the Commonwealth play really map onto that kind of hierarchy of museums in the UK. So they become very involved in the ones that we know about already, like the V&A's return of Buddhist relics, the the Mandalay regalia and that the return from the V&A, because they are national museums that have a big impact on kind of political machinations in the UK. But it's that kind of official voice does not have, there's no kind of relationship between broader international politics and what's going on in the crumbling down office of this poor guy in Bristol whose museum's half blown apart. And in fact, but it is, the Commonwealth is still there, because one of the arguments that I'm making is that these are Commonwealth networks. And to your point that you made about what kinds of repatriation take place when depending on who is in power, particularly in the former colony, is absolutely crucial, because what I'm suggesting is that people would not be sending anything back to a government that was anti-British, independent, had reached the secondary phase of decolonization, as Drayton calls it, in relation to the Caribbean, where they've moved away from that jolly Commonwealth, post-independence, flag independence, they call it, don't they? So I think Commonwealth is really critical in all of the different levels, in these white networks of professional practice, which are deeply enmeshed in Commonwealth structures. But formal government arrangements tend to be focused on the national, and that makes it quite a different discourse as well.
Thanks a lot. I think it would be wonderful to discuss in this round further, but we have several questions in the chat, or some people raised their hands. So I would like to open the discussion. And as far as I can see, Marie was the first, followed by Jonathan and Wayne. And I would like to start with Maria. Do you want to read your question yourself, or should we read it? Maria? Okay. Please, Zoe, can you just read it? Thank you.
Yes, of course. So Maria's question is, how can we deal with a case of museums that have what we know as sacred important objects? I'm thinking about the Nkisi Nkondi figures, for example, that have not been claimed.
I think it was to Sarah. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, do you want me to respond right away? Okay, that's a good question. There's part of the answer of your question is embedded in your question, because you put claimed between sort of brackets. You have to make claiming possible, is I think a first step. You have to, because so much of it is a consequence of colonialism itself and colonial archives and sort of the effects of colonialism on the ground, that sort of certain erasures have happened with regard to sort of information and connections. And so people don't know what is where anymore. So the making available of information and the making possible of claiming and getting in touch and exchange of information is a really important first step. But I think generally speaking, the more general answer to this is how to deal with that is not unilaterally, is to try and to have a broader conversation with the involvement of multiple stakeholders. And sometimes that's really difficult for museums, I think, because they're not used to relinquishing control in this kind of decision-making process. And I think perhaps that is something that we need that is needed in cases like this, that perhaps isn't in existence right now. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer.
Thank you for that. Then Jonathan, please.
Thank you very much for the very interesting panel. Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a slightly provocative question, picking up on Claire's presentation. I think it's an excellent point that restitutions are not per se kind of ethical or desirable. I wanted to ask a question from a slightly more Marxian perspective. When we talk about decolonialization, there's a lot of debate what it should mean, and a lot of the debate shifts towards kind of symbolic or knowledge-related issues. And the Marxist scholars usually point out that colonialism was, first of all, a project of enrichment of certain capitalist classes, conducted through oppression and exploitation. And they point out that decoloniality should center on both the history and the continuities of the material exploitation and its contemporary kind of continuities. So bringing it back to restitutions and provenance research, it seems to me that a lot of it as an outcome really centers around identity politics and certain symbolic recognition mostly. And it kind of falls and is embedded on often an essentialist logic and a kind of essentialized identitarian historiography that talks about communities of origin and countries of origin as if those entities, that it reifies those entities as if they exist over 200 years of history and are kind of central to history rather than other kind of more materialistic forms of historiography. So my kind of two questions really to all of you is firstly, do you see a possibility of a non-essentialist kind of form of restitutions that don't necessarily reify essentialist notions of ethnicity, nationality, or race, as it often happens? And my second question, is there a way of turning restitutions from what I see as largely kind of neoliberal kind of form of something that doesn't necessarily challenge the status quo to something that's truly kind of leftist and prioritizes redistribution, not just a kind of affirmation of identities, as Nancy Fraser brilliantly pointed it out in her essay on identity politics. So that's my slightly provocative question. I hope it's constructively provocative. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think you started that you wanted to ask Claire, but in essence, it goes to all of them. So who would like to answer first?
I'm happy to go first. You put the finger on it, exactly. This is something that, particularly the element of how going about this in a way that doesn't reify essentially colonial ideas about sort of identity and race and community and so on, is absolutely true. So how do you, I mean, I don't have you know, a clear answer, but I do have some thoughts in response to what you said. The issue of sort of the fact that this is a symbolic dossier in so many cases, and that there are the material inequalities and the economic inequalities that perhaps attention to the restitution dossier then sort of pushes into the background, so they can be manipulated that way. I do think it is not an or question, or it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be a stark choice between one and the other. I think both are possible in that sense, or attention to both is possible, and they can go hand in hand, because I do think that because it is a symbol dossier, it has the power to break open conversations. And I think that that's sort of what Felwine Sarr was getting at when he talks about these new relational ethics in the French report, is that if you can have a breakthrough in this particular dossier, it can have effects elsewhere. So I think that that's one way of approaching that question, because if you succeed in resetting relationships in the process of talking about restitution and cultural return and so on, and these exchanges, then perhaps that can have reverberations. So that's one way. Two is that I think it points us to the fact, it points us to how important process is, not necessarily literal outcome, but the process of how we engage each other and how we deal with this, and that this is not done in this sort of like, in this sort of quickly, let's just do some restitutions and here over, nothing to see here kind of a way, that it doesn't get abused in that sense, because then we waste its potential, I think, in that sense. I think I think it's Siraj Rasool who wrote about sort of restitution as what it can do. And I don't want to put words in his mouth because I see that he's here, so he can correct me if I'm wrong. But what it can be as a social movement in Africa, what it can do as a social movement there is perhaps the most important question of all, and the one that needs to be prioritized in sort of the way in which we approach this process. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I just want to mention that there are some more questions, and I think we are really in an interesting point. So we will take 5 minutes more for this panel. I hope Maria don't give us an acoustic signal that we have to leave, but I would like to ask you for short answers and the other people for short questions afterward.
Well,
but
could
Klaas,
we take a few more questions and then answer all together? Was that sensible? Or
yes, just close this one if you want to respond to this one, and then we will put some together. Yeah.
Klaas, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just very shortly, and echoing everything that Sarah just said is very interesting, and yeah, the question is also very interesting. Just a brief note. I think we can also make changes in the way how we do provenance research and the objects that we select for this type of research, and that the kind of stories that we are looking for in doing such research. And then I think we can think in two directions. One is actually a remarkable interest of all the old ethnographic museums also in the products that were taken from the colonized areas. So all the types of woods, all the types of minerals, all the types of crops. Those may not be logical candidates for restitution, but they can be an entry point in discussing, okay, what about all these crops and what function did they play in the colonial economic system? And another way, another alley that I'm thinking of, also modern political movements, anti-colonial movements, movements of the left, but also of the right. They also left objects, or you can also find objects in Western collections that testify to that history. So now I'm thinking of membership cards in the Netherlands that you can actually regard as an object, as all the other objects, or archives. And so, yeah, there are in that sense possibilities. I'll leave it to that, just short.
I don't really have a great deal to contribute to other than what Sarah and Klaas said, actually.
Great. So Wayne, please.
Yeah, thanks. Very quickly, thank you for your presentations. And very, very quickly, Sarah, amazing presentation. We should talk. I wonder what analytical yield could be gained, though, by actually focusing on what Macron did. Because one could suggest that he takes over from all of the activism, and that is a conversation that should be had. But what more precisely did it do as a kind of political conjuncture that is different from other moments? So that's one thing. Klaas, I want to caution you in a question by asking whether or not your understanding of decolonization is too narrow. Because in a funny way, if you connect your presentation with Sarah's presentation, the establishment of UNESCO is itself needs decolonization. So your presentation now just suggested that it was not decolonization with Sukarno Suharto or whomever, but it is possible that if I come from Jamaica, and since independence, Jamaica has still been fighting for decolonization because it has been fighting with the IMF, with UNESCO, with UN, with whatever. So is there a complex enough understanding of decolonization to answer properly the question that the project, this panel understands? And wonderful, Claire, my quick thing to you is, you're speaking of ethics. Whose ethics? The British Museum's ethics? Because the ethics of the time during Jamaica's revolutions was probably not the British one, but Taki and whomever. So well, how do we understand that ethical trajectory that you sketch when you go to Janet Marcy? Is there another way of thinking ethics outside of that ethics to be able to afford us something else than the European Western notion of what is ethical in this sense? That's quick, but my question is really to you, Klaas, because I wonder if there's some caution in your understanding of what decolonization is that actually doesn't give credit to the people who have been fighting for it.
Okay, the question was so rich, or the comment was so rich, so I would like to answer you right away before we add another question. So, Klaas.
Yeah, thank you, Wayne, and thank you also for this good question that I need to think about more. Of course, there's one thing, one very short comment that I made in the beginning of the presentation, and I really believe in that. Is who am I to think, or who am I to say that something fitted or did not fit in the agenda of decolonization, acting from the present, acting from the West, and also talking about past periods that are far away from us, and also in regions that are far away from me, at least. And so that's, yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah, I think I need to think more about this. Thank you for this this comment and question. And I hope to talk further with you about it.
Oh, certainly.
Someone else who would like to respond, or?
I can quickly respond to the Macron. If I understand correctly, the remark to start with, are you suggesting that sort of to start with exposing what Macron really is and the appropriation that is happening in what he does when he takes on this theme in particular in front of a student audience in Ouagadougou? Is that sort of the intent of your question?
Yeah, that is part of the intent of the question. But I think I mean, we should always give credit to all of the claims that have happened before that. But I'm just wondering, does Macron's moment signify something? Does it do something different than all of those other moments? And what does it do? Because that helps us to also understand this current conjuncture.
Yes. I think that's, yes, you're right. Yes. Historicizing the Macron moment itself. So to be honest, I don't know, I haven't quite fully figured out what it does. I feel like we're not out of it yet. And it's not a cop-out, it's my answer as a historian. It's like we're in the midst of something that I haven't quite figured out what it is yet, but it has to do, it does have to do with shifting relationships between sort of the global North and global South, and particularly Africa and former colonial powers in Europe itself. That is definitely an aspect of it, I think. And those relationships being sort of rejigged is not the right word, but sort of resettled, and sort of us moving into a new phase of sort of post Cold War relationships, that it has something to do with that, with the sort of geopolitical landscape. But I don't quite know yet. What do you think, if I may ask?
I think we don't have enough time, so I'm going to email you and let's talk about it outside of this.
Do you also want to respond, or should I go?
I think it's kind of responding to both of those questions about kind of positionality and the role that kind of grandstanding plays in all of this, like big politicians and what they say at the top of kind of the political pile, but actually how grassroots movements towards claiming restitution, I think on a smaller scale in smaller institutions, are worth exploring. One thing I did want to share, I only really, the last couple of days, was told by an amazing historian at Christchurch Museum, Hatessa Seomana Tower. She said that actually some of the objects that went from museums in the UK back to Aotearoa, New Zealand, as a result of Duff's journey, have actually in the end been sent back to their iwi and to their communities. So I don't know what that means for the arguments that I was making, but it just was kind of a good thing, I think, and just shows the impact of kind of, yeah, smaller groups of people and what they can do on things as well.
Great, thanks a lot. I would like to just add one last question. It's from Bernard. Share, please. Can you just unmute yourself and read your question? after that, I would like to wrap up the other questions. So unfortunately, we can't go through all this question, but I would like to have this one here.
Yes, thanks a lot. I hope you can hear me. It's a very short question. It's,
yes.
I mean, 3 great papers, but only to Klaas because I'm working on similar topics. So Klaas, fascinating to hear your story. As you know, I'm working from Switzerland and Germany, and I mean, all these empires are transnational. So many of these objects are not only in the former colonial metropole, but throughout Europe. So I was just wondering if you came across in your research, any other kind of interactions. Did the Indonesian government approach Germany, Switzerland, or did some of the other European countries get in contact yet with the Indonesian government about their collections in their museums and etc.? Thanks.
Yes, thank you for your question. And I think focusing on the governmental level, I'm not aware of such approachings of Indonesian government to European countries or the other way around. What I do know is that there is an increasing awareness in Indonesia among museum professionals and historians of this outer Dutch presence of objects in Europe, and particularly focusing on Britain and the short period that the British were in Indonesia, in Java, and looted the palace in Yogyakarta. That is an issue that is in the media, at least. And may I maybe come back to the question that Wayne asked, and it's just something that I've been thinking about also, is how to give voice also to people that lost after Suharto came to power, and how would they frame this question? Was it really all about decolonization, the returns that happened in the 1970s? And this is also something that I want to put in the mix, because we sometimes I'm a bit afraid that we tend to forget them as well. That's the skepticism that I want to try to catch in my presentation, but and that I wanted to share now, and I'm happy to continue the conversation later with you and others in a direct manner.
Wim, yeah.
I'm very hesitant to talk because I had my 10 minutes already, but basically following very briefly on what what Klaas just said, there is emerging scholarship also in Indonesia of very critical heritage professionals that also challenge the state-to-state approach that leaves out and disenfranchises communities within Indonesia. And so there's definitely new voices that are coming up, or voices that have not been heard until rather recently. And I think in this case, the conversation is very important to also extend the conversation beyond what we are doing right now to people beyond Europe. And very briefly on the previous question, it would be very interesting to look whether or not the Weltmuseum in Vienna is getting demands from Indonesia, because they hold an important also Indonesian collection. So definitely there is a lot to be researched in the future.
I would like to jump in here with a look at the time. So I think the time is nearly up, and I would like to say 2 or 3 other things. First of all, I would like to underline what Wim just said. In provenance research, it also started in some kinds in Europe, and then more and more cooperative projects or working together emerged, and the dialogue emerged. And I think if we research the history of restitution or the history of demands for returns, it is also important to have a dialogue and to do that together with colleagues, or at least to recognize that there is rich research in some of these countries. It's not possible to read all the comments in the chat, but I would like to point all of you to the chat. For example, there was one point when we talked about the Commonwealth and the role of the Commonwealth, where NIOD said there was also the League of Non-Aligned Countries and so on. So there were other organizations next to UNESCO. I think UNESCO we know all about that, or we know that it was there and that played an important role, but there were also other organizations. So it's good to read the chat. I think it's we don't have the time to go through all of you for some concluding remarks. And I think it's also too early to make concluding remarks on this topic. We need some more years for that. But I like to continue the discussion. Jonathan put his email address in the chat. You will find all of our email addresses on the conference website. So feel free, if you have other questions, if you would like to discuss anything, to write to us. I think it's important because we are an online conference and we don't have these coffee breaks where you normally talk to other people. So feel free to contact us, to write emails, or to call us. And we have another option to continue this debate or this discussion in our evening lecture with Benedict Savoy. She is chair of modern art history at the Technical University in Berlin, and she will talk about institutional and other lies. And I would like to point to that, as I think I'm looking really forward to it. And tomorrow is another day, so there will be more time to discuss these things. And I would like to close this panel with a huge thank to all of the speakers, to Wim for your comments, and to all the questions and everything who was willing to listen and to talk and to debate with us. So thanks a lot for that. And I hope we stay in contact and we will continue this someone else. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.